In 1988, during the recording of Smooth Criminal, Michael Jackson suddenly stopped breathing normally. The studio lights were bright, the music was perfect, and then, in a single terrifying second, the king of pop collapsed. What happened in that moment shocked everyone in the room. Why did Michael hide his pain from the world? Who rushed to his side first? And what did he confess minutes later that changed everything about how his team saw him? This is a story the studio never wanted you to hear. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our emotional stories about Michael Jackson. The studio was silent, except for the faint echo of footsteps on polished wood. Westlake Recording Studios, Los Angeles. Late at night in 1988. It was past midnight, but no one felt tired. Not the producers, not the engineers, not the musicians, and especially not Michael Jackson. He stood alone in the vocal booth, headphones over his ears, eyes closed, completely immersed in the rhythm of Smooth Criminal. The lights were dim except for a single warm spotlight that framed his silhouette. Outside the booth, Quincy Jones leaned forward in his chair, listening intently. The track began again. Michael's voice flowed through the room, smooth, controlled, haunting. Every word carried emotion. Every breath felt intentional. But something was off, very slightly. Michael swayed, not like a dancer, more like someone losing balance. Quincy raised his hand. "Hold on," he said through the intercom. "Take a breath, Michael." Inside the booth, Michael didn't respond. His chest rose and fell too quickly. Sweat glistened on his forehead. His hand gripped the microphone stand tighter than usual. The music continued. Then, suddenly, silence. A sharp gasp. Michael's body stiffened. The microphone slipped from his hand. And before anyone could react, he collapsed to the floor. The room exploded into motion. Quincy jumped up from his chair. Engineers rushed toward the booth. The glass door flew open. Footsteps thundered across the floor. "Michael! Michael, can you hear me?" Quincy shouted. One of the technicians knelt beside him, checking his pulse. Another grabbed water. Someone screamed for medical help. Michael's face was pale. His breathing was shallow. For a terrifying few seconds, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, suffocating, like the room itself was holding its breath. Then Michael stirred. His eyes fluttered open. Confusion filled his gaze. Quincy placed a hand on his shoulder. "Don't move," he said firmly. "Stay still." Michael blinked, trying to sit up. "I'm fine," he whispered weakly, but his body betrayed him. His hands trembled. His chest tightened. They helped him sit against the wall of the booth. The silence was deafening. Finally, Michael spoke again, softer this time. "I didn't want to stop." Quincy looked at him with deep concern. "Your body just told you to." Michael forced a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Moments later, paramedics arrived. As they checked him, Michael stared at the floor, avoiding everyone's gaze. He looked smaller, more fragile than anyone in that room had ever seen him. When they asked how long he had felt unwell, he hesitated. Then he said something that made the room freeze. "For weeks." No one knew. No one had noticed. Or maybe no one had wanted to see. As the medics prepared to take him for evaluation, Michael grabbed Quincy's sleeve. "Don't cancel anything," he said urgently. Quincy stared at him. "You just collapsed." Michael met his eyes, deadly serious. "If I stop now, I might never come back." The words hung in the air like a warning. Outside the studio, sirens wailed in the distance. Inside, Michael closed his eyes again, and as they lifted him onto the stretcher, he whispered something only one person heard, something that would haunt them forever. The ambulance moved through the night like a restless heartbeat. Sirens cut through Los Angeles streets, bouncing off glass buildings, empty parking lots, and quiet neighborhoods that had no idea the King of Pop was fighting to stay upright in the back of that vehicle. Inside, Michael lay on the stretcher, his eyes half closed, chest rising and falling too fast, his hand gripping the edge of the blanket as if the world beneath him were slipping away. A paramedic spoke calmly, asking questions in a steady rhythm, but Michael answered in fragments. His voice was weak, distant, as if it were traveling from somewhere far beyond his body. He stared at the ceiling of the ambulance, not really seeing it, his mind still in the studio, still hearing the echo of Smooth Criminal pulsing through his head. Quincy followed in another car, silent, jaw tight, hands folded in his lap. He replayed the collapse in his mind again and again, the sway, the sudden stillness, the fall, and with each repetition, guilt pressed heavier on his chest. He had seen the signs and said nothing. He had pushed the sessions harder because the music was perfect. Now perfection felt like a curse. At the hospital, bright lights replaced dim studio lamps. Doors slid open. Wheels squeaked against polished floors. Voices overlapped in clinical urgency. Michael was rolled into an examination room that smelled of antiseptic and electricity. Machines beeped softly around him, wires placed on his chest, blood pressure cuff tightening around his arm, oxygen resting beneath his nose. A doctor leaned over him, calm but serious. "Michael, can you hear me?" Michael blinked slowly. "Yes." "How long have you been feeling like this?" He hesitated again, the same way he had in the studio. His eyes drifted toward the door, as if searching for escape. "Longer than I want to admit," he finally whispered. Blood tests were taken. His heart was monitored. Nurses moved around him with practiced efficiency, but their eyes lingered just a second too long. Not at the superstar, but at the fragile man lying beneath the fluorescent lights. Quincy was allowed in after nearly an hour. He stood at the foot of the bed, hands in his pockets, shoulders slumped in a way few had ever seen. Michael turned his head slowly when he heard the door open. "You shouldn't be here," Michael murmured. Quincy let out a breath that sounded more like a confession than air. "Where else would I be?" Silence settled between them. Finally, Quincy stepped closer. "You scared the hell out of me." Michael looked at the ceiling. "I didn't mean to." The doctor returned, scanning charts, studying monitors. "You're stable," he said carefully, "but you pushed your body far beyond what it can handle right now. You're dehydrated, exhausted, and your stress levels are dangerously high." Michael swallowed. "Can I leave?" The doctor hesitated. "Not tonight." Michael closed his eyes. Quincy leaned against the wall, watching the man he had worked with for years look suddenly so small in that hospital bed. The legend dissolved, leaving only a human being who had been carrying too much for too long. When the room was quiet again, Quincy moved closer. "Talk to me," he said. Michael stared at his hands resting on the white sheets. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "I didn't want anyone to know." "Know what?" Quincy asked gently. "That I was tired." Quincy let out a bitter laugh. That wasn't really a laugh at all. "Michael, everyone is tired." Michael shook his head slowly. "Not like this." The studio felt different the day Michael returned. It looked the same, the glass walls, the blinking equipment, the polished floor, the familiar smell of cables and warm electronics. But the energy in the room had shifted. People moved more carefully. Voices were softer. No one laughed loudly. No one rushed him. Even the music seemed to breathe slower. Michael walked in quietly, wearing dark clothes and sunglasses, though the lights were not harsh. He paused at the doorway for a moment, letting his gaze sweep across the room, the way someone might look at a place they had known for years but were seeing with new eyes. Quincy was already there, sitting in his chair, arms crossed, his expression serious yet gentle. When he saw Michael, he stood immediately. "You sure about this?" Quincy asked. Michael removed his sunglasses and met his gaze. His eyes were clearer than they had been the night before, but there was a deep tiredness beneath them. "I have to do this," he said calmly. They did not argue. Inside the vocal booth, the microphone stood exactly where it had been when Michael collapsed. The same stand, the same pop filter, the same headphones resting on the shelf. For a moment, Michael simply stared at it, as if the object itself held a memory he was trying to read. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Quincy spoke through the intercom. "We'll go slow. No pressure. You stop whenever you need to." Michael nodded. The track began. At first, his voice was careful, controlled, almost fragile. He did not push. He did not force. He let the sound come naturally, as if he were singing to himself rather than to a future audience. Quincy leaned forward, listening closely, not for perfection this time, but for truth. As the song progressed, Michael grew stronger. His voice filled the space again, not with the aggressive intensity of the night before, but with something deeper, more intentional. Every note felt like a choice rather than a battle. Then, halfway through the take, he stopped. Silence filled the booth. Michael did not collapse this time. He simply stood still, eyes closed, breathing slowly. Quincy did not rush him. After several seconds, Michael spoke softly. "I need a moment." The music was cut. He stepped out of the booth and sat on the small chair beside it, resting his elbows on his knees. Sweat beaded lightly on his forehead, but his posture was steady. Quincy handed him water. "You're doing fine." Michael took a sip, but kept his eyes lowered. "It's not about fine," he murmured. "It's about honest." Quincy studied him quietly. They returned to the booth. This time, Michael sang differently. His voice carried vulnerability, almost pain, yet also a strange clarity. It was as if the collapse had stripped away his defenses and left only the raw core of his artistry. Several engineers exchanged glances behind the glass. This was not just a recording anymore. It felt like a confession. When the take ended, no one spoke at first. The sound hung in the air like something sacred. Finally, Quincy leaned back and exhaled slowly. "That's it," he said quietly. Michael opened his eyes, surprised. "Really?" Quincy nodded. "Really?" For a brief moment, a genuine smile crossed Michael's face. Not the performer's smile, but something softer, almost shy. But the relief did not last long. As the room relaxed, Michael stepped back into the hallway alone. He leaned against the wall, pressing his back to it, closing his eyes. His breathing was steady, but his thoughts were racing. He thought about the night before, the hospital lights, the doctor's words, his children asleep in their rooms, the way the microphone had slipped from his hand. A quiet realization settled inside him. He could not keep living as he had been. Quincy found him there a few minutes later. They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Michael spoke without opening his eyes. "I've been running for a long time." Quincy didn't pretend not to understand. "From what?" Michael swallowed. "From stopping." Quincy leaned against the wall beside him. "Stopping doesn't mean disappearing." Michael opened his eyes slowly. "In my world, it often does." Quincy looked at him carefully. "You don't belong to that world as much as you think." Michael let out a small breath that was almost a laugh. "It built me." "Maybe," Quincy said, "but it doesn't own you." Back in the control room, they listened to the take again. Michael sat beside Quincy this time. Not behind glass, not hidden away, but present in the same space as everyone else. As his voice filled the room, he closed his eyes. When the song ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Then one of the engineers quietly said, "That's the best thing you've done all week." Michael did not boast. He simply nodded. Later that night, as the studio lights dimmed and people packed up their equipment, Michael lingered. He walked slowly through the room, touching the same walls, the same mirrors, the same speakers he had touched the night he collapsed. Quincy watched him from a distance. Michael stopped at the microphone one last time. He placed his hand over his heart, just as he had before, but this time there was no fear in his expression, only resolve. He turned toward Quincy. "I'm not going to destroy myself for this," Michael said quietly. Quincy met his gaze. "Good." Michael looked around the emptying studio again, as if making peace with it. Outside, the city glowed beneath the night sky, distant lights flickering like stars fallen to earth. As Michael stepped into his car, he paused for a moment, looking up at the clouds. This time, he did not seem afraid. He seemed thoughtful. At home, the house was quiet again. He walked through the halls slowly, stopping outside his children's rooms, listening, breathing, grounding himself in the life that mattered most. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed, hands folded in his lap. He did not pray in desperation this time. He prayed in gratitude. And as sleep finally came, his face softened into something peaceful, almost certain. But somewhere deep inside, a new tension had begun to form. Because even though he had survived that night, and even though he had recorded the song, Michael Jackson now understood something he could never fully ignore again. His body had limits. And the choice he would face next, whether to slow down or keep pushing, would shape not just his career, but his destiny. And that choice was coming far sooner than anyone in that studio could have imagined. The days that followed carried an uneasy calm. To the outside world, nothing had changed. Reporters spoke excitedly about Michael's return to the studio, about Smooth Criminal, about his creative fire, about how the king of pop was still at the top of his game. Headlines shimmered with optimism, and fans waited eagerly for every update. Inside Michael, however, everything felt different. He moved more slowly through his routines. He listened more carefully to his body. He noticed things he had long ignored. The tightness in his chest after long sessions, the trembling in his hands when he pushed too hard, the way his breath sometimes caught when he tried to sing late at night. Quincy kept his promise. Sessions were shorter now. More breaks, more water, more rest, less pressure. But Michael could feel something beneath the surface that no schedule could control. Fear had entered the room, not the kind that paralyzes, but the kind that whispers, "You are not invincible." One afternoon, as sunlight poured through the studio windows, Michael stood alone in the vocal booth, staring at the microphone that had nearly become his breaking point. The room beyond the glass was empty. No engineers, no Quincy, no assistants, just him and his reflection. He reached out and touched the glass, seeing himself mirrored back, thinner, older, softer, but somehow more real. For a long moment, he did not move. Then he spoke quietly, almost to himself. "Who am I without this?" His voice did not carry bravado, only vulnerability. Later that day, Quincy found him sitting on the studio floor, back against the wall, eyes closed, breathing slowly. "You okay?" Quincy asked gently. Michael opened his eyes and smiled faintly. "I'm thinking." Quincy sat beside him without saying anything. They stayed there for several minutes, listening to the distant hum of the city outside. Finally, Michael turned to him. "I've spent my whole life running toward something," he said. "Applause, perfection, acceptance, love. But after that night in the hospital, I realized I've never really run toward myself." Quincy exhaled slowly. "That's not a bad realization." Michael nodded, but his expression was heavy. "It's terrifying." They returned to work, but the sessions had a different tone. Michael no longer chased perfection, as if his life depended on it. Instead, he searched for truth in his voice, in his movement, in his presence. When he sang, his tone carried something deeper than ever before. Pain, hope, awareness. During one take, he paused mid-song, removed his headphones, and looked directly at Quincy through the glass. "I don't want to just be remembered for how I sounded," he said softly. "I want to be remembered for what I felt." Quincy nodded, unable to speak. That evening, Michael went home earlier than usual. The house was quiet again. He walked through the halls slowly, stopping in front of his children's rooms. He stood there longer than he ever had before, listening to their soft breathing on the other side of the doors. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of his bed and placed his hands over his heart. For the first time in years, his prayer was not about success. It was about life. The next morning, he returned to the studio with a new determination, not to push harder, but to choose differently. He gathered the team before they began. Everyone fell silent as he spoke. "I love what we're creating here," he said calmly, "but I love my life more." The room froze. Quincy's chest tightened. Michael continued, his voice steady. "I'm not quitting. I'm not giving up. But I won't destroy myself for music either. If I fall again, we stop. No arguments." There was a long pause. Then Quincy nodded slowly. "That's fair." They worked that day with focus and respect. Michael sang beautifully, not from desperation, but from presence. Every note felt intentional, every breath meaningful. When the session ended, the room felt lighter than it had in weeks. But as Michael stepped outside into the cool night air, something still weighed on him. He stood beside his car, looking up at the sky. The clouds moved slowly, drifting like quiet thoughts across the darkness. He whispered softly, almost to himself, "I'm listening now." In the days that followed, Michael began to open up in ways he never had before. He spoke more with his family. He laughed more with his team. He admitted when he was tired instead of pretending he wasn't. But beneath that openness, a quiet tension remained. His body had spoken once. It might speak again. Late one night, after everyone else had left, Michael returned alone to the studio. The lights were dim. The equipment was silent. The space felt vast and empty. He walked slowly to the center of the room. He lifted his arms, just as he had before, but this time he did not reach upward in desperation. He stood still, present, breathing. Then very slowly he bowed, not to the music, not to the audience, to his own life. When he straightened, his eyes glistened. He whispered one final line into the empty space. "Thank you for still being here." Outside, the city hummed beneath the night sky. Michael stepped into his car and looked up one last time before leaving. His expression was calm, almost peaceful, but deep inside, a question lingered, one that would shape everything that came next. If his body spoke again, would he finally listen? The following weeks passed in a strange balance between creation and caution. The studio sessions continued, but the atmosphere had softened. No more late-night marathons. No more endless retakes until exhaustion blurred the room. Quincy moved with quiet authority, stopping takes before Michael ever had to ask. Engineers watched not just the meters on their boards, but the rhythm of Michael's breathing. Still, the music grew more powerful. In every vocal line, there was something new, a tenderness that felt lived in, a clarity that came from awareness rather than ambition. When Michael sang Smooth Criminal, the menace in the song was still there, but beneath it now ran a current of humanity that made it haunting in a different way. One afternoon, sunlight poured through the high windows of the studio, turning dust into floating constellations. Michael stood in the booth, headphones resting loosely around his neck instead of tightly over his ears. For the first time in years, he did not seem at war with the microphone. He closed his eyes and let the track play. His voice came in softly at first, then grew not by force, but by intention. Every breath was measured, every phrase shaped with care. Quincy watched through the glass, leaning forward, barely blinking. Halfway through the take, Michael stopped himself. Silence filled the room. He did not look panicked. He did not look tired. He simply looked thoughtful. He removed the headphones and stepped out of the booth. Quincy met him halfway. "What do you need?" Michael took a slow breath. "I need to feel it, not chase it." Quincy nodded. "Then feel it." They took a break. Michael wandered down the hallway behind the studio, where the noise of equipment faded into quiet hum. He leaned against the wall, pressing his back to it, closing his eyes for a moment. Images surfaced, childhood rehearsals, his father's stern voice, bright lights, roaring crowds, empty hotel rooms, applause that felt endless and isolating all at once. He felt the weight of decades pressed gently against him, not crushing, but undeniable. When he opened his eyes, he did not look lost. He looked clearer. Back in the studio, the session resumed. This time, when Michael stepped into the booth, he placed his hand over his heart before singing, not as a ritual, but as a reminder. The take that followed was breathtaking. It was not louder. It was not sharper. It was deeper. When the final note faded, no one spoke for several seconds. The room seemed to breathe together. Quincy finally leaned back in his chair and let out a slow exhale. "That's it," he said quietly. Michael opened his eyes, surprised but calm. "You're sure?" Quincy smiled softly. "More than I've ever been." A gentle smile touched Michael's face, small, real, almost private. Later that evening, as the crew packed up, Michael lingered once more in the emptying studio. The lights were dimmer now, shadows stretching across the floor like long memories. He walked slowly to the center of the room. He stood still. For a long moment, he did nothing. Then, very deliberately, he bowed, not deeply, not theatrically, but with quiet respect. Not to the audience, not to the music, to the space that had nearly broken him, and yet had also helped him find himself. Quincy watched from the doorway, and said nothing. On the drive home, Michael stared out the window, watching the city slide past in streaks of light. He felt tired, but not hollow. For the first time in a long while, his exhaustion felt honest instead of destructive. At home, the house greeted him with familiar stillness. He walked through the halls slowly, pausing outside his children's rooms. This time, he opened one door just enough to look inside. Moonlight spilled across the floor, touching the edge of the bed where his child slept peacefully. Michael stood there silently for several minutes. When he finally turned away, his face carried both love and resolve. In his bedroom, he sat on the edge of the bed and placed his hands together. His prayer was simple, not a plea, not a bargain, just gratitude. Thank you for today. Thank you for breath. Thank you for life. Sleep came more easily that night. The next morning, Michael returned to the studio with a calm determination that surprised even Quincy. He was not pushing. He was not retreating. He was moving with intention. They worked through final touches on the track, subtle adjustments, small refinements, but the heart of the song was already there. During a break, Michael stood near the window and watched the sky. Clouds drifted slowly, soft and indifferent. Quincy joined him. "You look different," Quincy said quietly. Michael smiled faintly. "I feel different." "Better?" Quincy asked. Michael considered the word. "Not better. Aware." Quincy nodded, understanding more than he said. As evening approached, the session wound down. Equipment hummed softly as it powered off. People gathered their things, speaking in low tones. Michael lingered once again. He walked the microphone one last time, not to sing, but simply to stand there. He placed his hand over his heart and closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, he looked toward Quincy through the glass. "I'm not running anymore," Michael said quietly. Quincy smiled. Outside, the city glowed beneath the night sky, endless and restless. Michael stepped into his car and paused before closing the door. He looked up at the clouds drifting above, then slowly lowered his gaze to the horizon. His expression was calm. But beneath that calm, a quiet truth remained. His body had spoken once. It might speak again. And now, he knew the question that would define everything that came next. When the next warning arrived, subtle or sudden, would he choose the music or would he choose himself? As the car pulled away into the night, that question traveled with him. Silent, inevitable, and closer than anyone could imagine. The studio was quiet in a way it had never been before. Not empty, not abandoned, but softened, as if the walls themselves had learned to breathe more gently with him. In the days after the final take of Smooth Criminal, Michael returned not to chase perfection, but to sit with what he had created. He would stand near the control room glass, listening to playback, eyes closed, letting the sound wash over him instead of trying to command it. Quincy noticed a change immediately. Michael no longer leaned forward in anxiety during playback. He leaned back, hands folded in his lap, as if he were finally allowing himself to receive his own art instead of fighting it into existence. One afternoon, they played the completed track straight through. No stops, no edits, no notes. When the last beat faded, the room stayed silent longer than necessary. Engineers looked at one another, knowing something rare had just happened. Quincy removed his headphones slowly and turned toward Michael. "Well," he asked quietly. Michael opened his eyes. For the first time in weeks, there was no tension in his face, only clarity. "It's honest," he said. Quincy smiled, not as a producer, but as a man who had just watched someone save himself. That evening, Michael walked back into the vocal booth alone. The lights were dim, the space calm. He did not sing. He simply stood there, resting his palm lightly on the microphone stand, remembering the night he had fallen. He did not feel fear. He felt gratitude. He whispered softly into the empty room. "You tried to tell me something, and I finally listened." At home, things changed too. He began sleeping more, eating more, laughing more easily with his children. He let himself sit still without guilt. A radical act for a man who had spent his life in motion. One night, he tucked his child into bed and lingered longer than usual, brushing hair from their face, memorizing the rise and fall of their breathing. In that moment, The stage felt very far away, and life felt incredibly close. Weeks later, when Smooth Criminal was released, the world reacted the way it always had to Michael Jackson, with thunderous applause, endless praise, and breathless fascination. Critics spoke of its genius, its darkness, its precision, but they did not know what lived beneath it. They did not know about the hospital lights, the trembling hands, the whispered prayers, the choice to stop running. Quincy sat beside Michael during one early listening session with the label. As the song played to the speakers, executives leaned forward in awe, talking about hits, charts, and legacy. Michael stayed quiet. Afterward, in a private hallway, Quincy turned to him. "You could have broken yourself for this," Quincy said gently. Michael nodded. "I almost did." Quincy studied his face. "But you didn't." Michael placed his hand over his heart, not as a performance, but as a promise. "I chose to stay." Years later, when people would ask Michael about his most difficult moments in music, he rarely spoke of tours, lawsuits, or scandals. Instead, he spoke quietly about that night in the studio, the moment his body forced him to face his limits. "It saved me," he once said, "not from failure, but from myself." In the studio, the microphone he once feared became a quiet symbol of balance. He would return to it often, not to dominate it, but to remember, art is not war with your body. It is a conversation with your soul. The people who worked with him noticed something subtle but profound. His performances were still breathtaking, but now they carried a new kind of power, not frantic brilliance, but grounded truth. When he moved, it felt intentional. When he sang, it felt lived. And in that shift, his music became even more timeless. One evening, long after Smooth Criminal had become an icon, Michael stood alone in that same studio. The lights were low. The room was empty. He walked slowly to the center of the floor where he had once collapsed. He closed his eyes. He breathed. Then, very slowly, he bowed, not to the audience, not to fame, not to music, but to his own life. When he straightened, his face held something rare and a legend: peace. He understood then that his greatest performance was not a song, a dance, or a stage. It was choosing to live. As he stepped outside into the night air, the city glowed beneath him, restless and endless. He looked up at the sky, breathing deeply, feeling the simple miracle of being here. In that moment, he knew something that would guide him forever. Legends are not defined by how hard they push. They are defined by when they choose to stop. And Michael Jackson, the boy from Gary, the king of pop, the man behind the myth, had finally learned how to listen to his body, to his heart, to his life. The world would remember Smooth Criminal for its brilliance, but Michael would remember it for something deeper. It was the song that almost broke him, and the moment that saved him. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and share it with someone who loves Michael Jackson. If this story inspired you, remember, even legends face battles unknown to the world. Subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who loves Michael Jackson.